to Inside the Recording Studio. I am Jody Whitesides, and with me is Mr. Chris Hellstrom. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing very well, Jody. There's my energetic buddy. That was a lot more power than last week's episode.
Yeah. Well,
yeah.
You know, I was trying to get that effect for what we were talking about last week, so
yeah.
Apparently I did it so well it freaked you out.
It did.
Probably
it did,
freaked out a lot of other people,
That's
too.
not the Jody that I know. So, no, I'm doing all right, man. I'm doing good. I'm ready to nerd out some today.
Nerd out.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about the PulTec today.
We are.
Deep into its history and its inner workings and all that kind of stuff. And the irony of this situation is I'm going to let you run more with the history, and I guess I'll talk more about the usage this time around.
Yeah, let's do that.
So are we just going to just dive right in then on our deep dive? Let's go right into the deep end.
I think we should, because there's kind of a lot to get to here, and it's another one like the other deep dives that we've done have been classic pieces of gear, right? And important gear, and this is
no
just
different.
Like that.
Very classic.
Absolutely, in the very true sense of the word. So,
so kick it off then.
I shall. So, PulTec, the PulTec EQ, and while there are several different versions of this, we're talking about the main one today that we kind of think about, and we're going to talk about the what's the name here? It rolls off the tongue. The EQP1A. But before we get to that, let's do a little bit of backtracking here and see where it kind of comes from. PulTec is a company. Pulse Technologies is an abbreviation of that.
So now you know where that came from.
That's it. Yeah.
Pulse Technologies.
And there will be other abbreviations here that we'll have to clear up as well on the interface and things. But started by two gentlemen in the 50s.
In a garage.
In a garage, in Jersey, I think. Eugene Schenk and Oliver Summerlin. Mm-hmm. And without going into super detail of all that kind of stuff, but the first thing that they built was actually a test oscillator called the P1. And this was for, again, we start noticing a thread here, but this was for broadcasting, for testing audio gear and that kind of thing. And it had a sweeping amplifier for them to test. But with changes in times here, they quickly came up with the idea that they wanted to build an EQ.
Good on them. Well done, you guys.
Yeah, and everybody else here, we can thank them for at this point, right? And in the early 50s, they came out with their first EQ model. Now, this is a passive EQ as well. And without going into detail about that, because I can't speak eloquently about that because I'm not an electrical engineer. But what a passive EQ does, so I've been told, is that it lowers the levels of everything that you send through it. You will lose essentially 15 dB by just running stuff through that. So you need some sort of amplifying stage to bring the signal back up. So the PulTec has 3 different tubes in it. It is not entirely solid state.
It is a tube EQ.
It is. So the first EQ then, the EQP1, was the first one that came out. And if anybody's ever seen the EQ, you obviously know what the PulTec looks like. But
that I do.
But the layout can be a little confusing if you've never used one. And even when you start using one, until you get to grips with it, it's like, okay, what is this? But what we have on, let's say, to the left side of the unit, we have a boost and an attenuation knob. Boost is obviously, we're boosting signal. Attenuation is the opposite. We're lowering or attenuating the signal.
Yep.
Underneath that, we have a frequency selector where on the units themselves it says CPS. That stands for cycles per second. So it's essentially just frequency.
Yes.
Right? And on those
there's a
early
reason
ones,
for that before you jump into like saying what
Go
those
for it. Yeah,
things
yeah,
are.
yeah.
There's a reason for why they use CPS rather than hertz at the time. And that is because the definition of it at that time that they had created the unit had not switched over and been uniformly discussed as being HZ.
Wow. Yeah.
That is the reason why it was originally termed under CPS, is because
that's fascinating.
that is prior to when hertz was actually considered the norm of what it should be called. Little tidbit of information.
Know that.
Now you know.
Just like I've said before, yeah, I got to listen to this podcast more often. I learned something, yeah.
You might get something in your head.
When did that happen?
It must have happened sometime after the EQP1 came out because so sometime in the mid-60s, maybe?
Yeah.
Mid to late 60s is my guess, because this was kind of the EQP1 was like early 60s, right?
Early 50s.
Early 50s. Well, then maybe it probably happened sometime in the right around the 60s, early 60s. I don't know.
Yeah.
I didn't like dive into the research of when they decided to start calling things hertzes instead of cycles per second.
Yeah, that's nerd level 10, right?
that goes beyond my musicianship level and my basic production level into like way beyond geek level of like Neil deGrasse Tyson. So
yeah, well, there you go. That's interesting though. So we had a frequency. We still have a frequency selector on those that goes from 30 cycles, 60, and 100.
Yes,
and we obviously have the ability to boost and or cut there as well. We'll go into the usage of that. I think why that's important later. We then have a high shelf that we can boost also. And this also has a variable frequency. Mm-hmm. This one goes from 3K, 5K, 8K, 10, and 12. Right? And this one also has a variable width of the band. And that's the bandwidth knob that we have under there. Yeah.
As most people call it now.
Right. Yeah. At that point, it's bandwidth. And that's what makes, to me, the layout a little bit odd, because right next to that boost knob, there's another attenuation knob.
Yes.
But that is not dependent on that same shelf frequency. So this one has another attenuation selector. And on the very first model, that was set to just 10K. Mm-hmm. There was no other option. You could attenuate the high shelf at 10K. That was it. There was no other ones. That changed a little bit on the EQP1A, where we got a few more frequencies in there. So should I rattle those guys off as well before we do that, or should we talk a little bit about the usage? Let's just do that.
You do you, and I will follow along.
All right. So in the 60s, early 60s, mm-hmm. the P1A came out, and we got a couple more frequencies here. We now at the low shelf, we got added a 20 hertz or 20 cycles per second. The mid was also expanded. We now had 3K, 4K, 5K, 8, 10, and 12, and 16. So we got a little bit wider range there as well. And at this model also, we had the high shelf attenuation, where we got the 10, or I'm sorry, we had the 10 already, mm-hmm. but we now got the 5 and 20 as well. And this is the unit that most of us tend to think about. I think we see that big blue 3 unit,
3 rack unit. Space, yep.
Right, that's the one. So, and these two guys more or less made all of them themselves. They did have additional staff that would put them together. So this was very much like a small-time operation, but that they kept everything high quality and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of these units were,
well, now you'd be lucky to find one if you can get one.
Yeah, and if you can get one and it's in working order,
and it's probably ridiculously expensive if you can find one.
Indeed. There are obviously. They resurrected the company, or the company got resurrected essentially in the early 2000s. We were talking about this before, but it's kind of funny, or at least interesting, or sad, depending on your view. but the company was active up until 1981.
Right.
And Eugene Schenk wanted to retire, as the story goes, and nobody wanted to buy the company. Nobody wanted to purchase the company, so they just closed it down. Yeah.
Can you say ouch?
Yeah, and this is in 81. And so it's before, there's one more model that we think about there as well that is still in production today that we'll talk about that one with the company as well, will get resurrected. But there is one model called the EQP1A3.
Mm-hmm.
And the only difference of this one as opposed to the 1A is that it's 2 rack spaces tall as opposed to 3, and it has a silver face.
The humor of that, though, when you think about it, is it's called the 3, and now it's a 2 rack space.
Right.
It's like, why didn't they just call it the 2?
Yeah, we'll have to ask Mr. Schenk if we ever get that opportunity.
Or Mr. Summerlin, because since Schenk is retired himself, maybe he's not around.
I'm pretty sure that I'm not sure that they're both with us anymore. Yeah, I didn't go that far, but yeah, that's an interesting story. But that was supposedly for studios were getting more and more gear and this kind of thing, so space was at a premium. So they squeezed it into a
smaller
2
form
unit.
factor. Yes,
right. Yeah,
that's a 30% savings in space right there.
There you go. Right. Yeah.
Maybe that's why it's called the 3.
Interesting thought. Probably not, but interesting. You could lie to somebody and just say that with proper conviction, and they'll probably buy it. So
that's
yeah.
right.
And lastly, that we'll bring up here is in early 2000. The company was sort of resurrected by a gentleman called Steve Jackson. Mm-hmm. And with the guidance of Schenk, he is now reproducing these units again, and they're identical replicas. And he even supposedly went as far as to recreate the electronic components. So it's not new components doing this. He's recreated the old components.
So he's using NOS. New old stock is what they call that.
Yeah, he, from the way I understand it, is that he's now manufacturing the parts or giving specific manufacturing to the parts so that they're behaving exactly like the old parts. It's not like they're the same components, but made now. Well, they are made now, but with the specifications of the old gear. That
I got you. So it's not new old stock. It's actually new stock. It's just replicating old stock.
Right. Yeah, I know.
What would they call that? NROS? New replicated old stock?
They just call it PulTec parts. Yeah.
Because, just as a quick aside on that, that was Aspen Pittman's big thing.
Yeah.
Was having old stock tubes. And the whole thing with Groove Tubes, who was Aspen Pittman's company, Groove Tubes, their big thing was he had a way of testing tubes and being able to grade them based on their performance of his tests to be able to understand how to sell them better to other people. And then anything they rejected went to other companies. So a lot of the times he got all the first pick of everything. He'd go test it, and then anything he didn't want, they went off and got sold by other companies.
That's a good position to be in. Yeah.
Right? So it just seems kind of interesting. But he made a big deal about what they called NOS, new old stock. So it's just kind of interesting. This guy is going to the great lengths of being able to recreate old stock in a replicated sense.
Yeah.
So I would term that, instead of NOS, that's NROS, new replicated old stock. Who knows?
That's probably a good way of putting it. But yeah, so they're up and running.
It's like gear derangement syndrome.
Yeah. So, but they're up and running, and they're fantastic EQs. Obviously, you work with them more than I do.
I do. I like them.
But as the saying goes, it's hard to make anything sound bad with them. And a couple of episodes ago, we talked about different types of EQ and corrective EQ and all this kind of stuff. And this would be one that I would firmly plant in the sort of sweetening EQ. You're making something sound better, more often than not. I think you'd almost have to apply yourself to make something sound bad going through this type of EQ. Broadly speaking,
But
yeah.
you can do wrong with them. It's just it's a little more difficult. But the bigger problem ends up being, getting your head wrapped around the interface of using it. Whether you're using the hardware version or the GUI version that replicates it, it takes a moment to kind of wrap your head around the concept,
the layout
of the EQ. And as you were actually initially talking about it, I actually was making these funny designs on the screen.
The triangles,
because that's how you have to think of the thing, because the area of each portion of the EQ, it fits into like this little triangular shape. And it's like one goes this way, one goes that way, and then the other one kind of shifts off to the other side. So anyway.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really good way of coming to grips with it. When you see those triangles, it sort of makes sense.
Yes.
There's still some wrapping around in your head that you need to do what it actually does. But once you do that, it's not the underpinnings, but the operation is relatively straightforward.
Yeah. And to kind of just riff off on where you're about to go with like who's still making these things or who's creating hardware versions of them. You had initially said that this guy, Mr. Jackson, has reinvigorated or resurrected the company of Pulse Technologies. But Warm Audio also makes these things. Another company called Pro Replicas make these things. In addition to that, if you really feel super inclined, you can actually get the schematics and build one for yourself.
Yeah.
Because
I'm
they
pretty
are
sure
available
they're also... Yeah, and I think they're even... there are kits, just like there are to a lot of the... When we talked about the 1176s and that type of thing, that you can, if you're handy enough with a soldering iron and you're so inclined, there are kits that you can get to do that. Just keep in mind that if you want them on your master bus, you're going to need to make two of them. They're not stereo units. Yeah. But yeah, so that's cool. And then of course we live in a software world today, right? So. Lots of different ones. So which ones? I mean, you being a UA guy, obviously you're using their versions, but who else is making these?
Well, Waves comes to mind.
Yeah,
they make one. Softtube makes one.
Yeah, the PulTec, right?
The Waves ones are based on Jack Joseph Puig's, which you're getting his replicated models because he obviously owns the real thing. Logic also comes with one in their vintage EQ set.
That's interesting because that one actually includes the interface. We didn't talk about. We mentioned it in passing, but the mentioned it in passing. I can speak.
Yes.
It includes the mid EQ as well.
Right. And
in the Logic one. Yeah.
The UA series, the PulTec collection there, actually has quite a few. They have the EQ P1A, which is obviously the most widely recognized version of the EQ by PulTec. They also have the MEQ5, which is the 3-band mids of 2 boosts and 1 attenuated signal there. And they also have what is known as the HLF3C, which is the high and low frequency cutoffs. So, which is just a 2-band thing, and it's just a low pass filter and a high pass filter as one little EQ range. And then if you have the universal audio version, you get what they call the PulTec Pro Legacy, which is very similar to what you're saying with the Logic version. It is the regular EQP1 coupled with the MEQ5 all in one interface. So it becomes like a 5-space rack looking thing. It's giant. But it still sounds great, even though it's considered a legacy thing. The missing piece in the PulTec Legacy, I guess, recreations in the Universal Audio software have to do with the transformer stage. They don't recreate the transformer in the legacy ones, whereas in the full-blown, like, here's the whole thing that chews up a whole lot of extra DSP, they actually also recreate the transformer and the harmonic distortion that it creates inside the EQ as well. So sometimes I'll just grab the Pro EQ Legacy because it's light on the DSP, but it still has that PulTec sound to it, and it's got everything. Instead of running 2 plugins at once, you can run one and be good with it. So
yeah. So it's a beast. So
and I've used the Waves versions as well. They sound great.
Yeah, and we mentioned it again before with, or I mentioned it when we talked about EQ as well. I'm a Slate guy. There's no one-on-one sort of recreation of that, but what comes really close there is the Custom Series EQ, where it has similar curves, and also that there's a scaled-down version of that. It's called the Lift, which is a boost-only EQ, but there also you've got low-end, and the high-end that you can, with a couple of variations on the curves there as well. So similar, that kind of thing where we can just sweeten everything, we boost a little bit of the lows and boost a little bit of highs, and everybody's super happy.
There's one other little interesting thing, though, that has not yet been mentioned, and that is just using the EQP1 in the signal path without doing anything. Actually boosts your signal by about 1.1 dB.
Across the whole spectrum?
Yep.
Wow.
Yeah, it's got about a little over a 1 dB gain to it. Go figure.
Because I know, but that's something that apparently the old units would do. That even if you didn't boost or cut anything, it would impart a color on the sound.
Yes.
And I just tried it out.
And that's the whole point of using this kind of stuff is color. It's color. So and I have to do some testing here. I have the Waves versions as well, and I will need to do some further testing on that. How much they impart by just being active, I'll probably go back and do my little white noise trick to do that, to kind of check that and see how much they're actually importing. Yeah, go back and check the Tuesday tips if you haven't seen that one. But it's a pretty neat little thing where you can kind of see what's going on. Oh, yeah. Well, before we jump into the next section, let's just take a quick word from our sponsor. All right, what are we talking about next, Chris?
I think it's about time to talk about usage now, right? How do we use these bad boys? Because we talked about how they work and how they're laid out. But maybe you can go in and talk a little bit about how you like to use them, where you like to use them, and how you tend to do that.
Oh, boy. Let me count the ways.
Go.
Generally speaking.
How much time you got?
That's right. So, you just laid a pile right on me. What's the best
where's your first go-to? Where do you use them first on? Like, whatever type of instrument, this is where I'm going to use the PulTec. Or do you tend to go two-bus with it? Or what do you
No. I go individual with it quite a bit. And more often than not, it has more to do with the character I want to imbibe on the entire mix. So the fortunate thing with having software versions of this is that you're not limited to having maybe one or two of them in your studio and you're being very judicious with it. You have the ability to go wildly nuts if you have software versions. So I will oftentimes, if I am not using the Helios on guitars, I will use the PulTec on guitars.
On individual guitars or your guitar bus?
And the reason for that is because I will choose slightly different settings to create slightly different spaces, especially if guitars are getting panned across from each other. And the reason for that being is that you want to create, you don't want to just replicate one guitar from one side to the other side, because then you're not really expanding the horizon, so to speak, when you do that. So I will use different settings on guitars that are panned opposite of each other. I do the same thing when I'm doing them on drums, because I will use them on drums. I use them on bass. On rare occasions, I will actually use them on vocals as well. So I use that thing in quite a few instances in various places, depending on the vibe that I'm trying to give the mix. That it comes more down to research and wanting to have a certain vibe on a mix more than anything of how I will use it. And generally speaking, I will use the PulTec more often when I know that something has been properly tracked. If something is improperly tracked and there are hugely, grossly out of character things going on in the sound, obviously you can't use the PulTec as a way of, or means of massive correction on things. It is more for something that has been thoughtfully thought out when it was tracked. It's a good way of putting it.
No, I agree, because I think it's not a
it's not a corrected
to me
EQ.
At least. Yeah, it's not a fixing EQ, it's a better making EQ,
Yes.
right? You're sweetening something. And I was doing some experimentation during the week here when I had some time of putting this on kick drum, for example. It's fantastic on a kick drum.
Oh, yeah. And that's a good starting place for that as well.
Yeah. I just read, I'm not sure if it's true, but studying a little bit for these for today's episode. Apparently, Chris Lord-Alge has 2 of these on his main output. So on every mix, there will be a little bit of a boost, and on the low end,
it's that
the high.
And I could probably guesstimate as to how he's actually using it when he does that, because I've not researched it. But there's a reason that it's really cool with the low end out of that EQ. And it has to do with the way the boost and attenuation works.
Yes. This would be a good time to go into that, because we just kind of glossed over that, where they're essentially, they have the same frequency, but tell us why that.
Well, and this is why I tend to use it on
does.
certain situations, is specifically because of this situation. So when you set the frequency of the low end, which is on the left triangular inverted triangle of the EQ interface. I don't know which side it would be on the screen, but
if you're listening to this, Jody is
I'm trying to do
wildly.
like hand motions on the screen. So Anyway, trying to do hand signals here where it is on the interface of how it actually looks, so to speak, of the triangle that I'm talking about. So the thing about it is you have your switch that you can switch either 20, 30, 60, and 100, I believe is, I'm quite sure that that's the low end, because I'm not looking directly at it right now. So I'm going by memory. And then what you can do is you can just do a straight up boost and leave the attenuation on 0, which is kind of like a low shelf thing that goes on. But at the same time, a lot of the time, what a lot of guys will do, and I do this a lot, is that you can do like this nice 3 to 5 dB boost on, say, 100 on a kick, or even 60. So, if you really want that lower thud, you do it at 60. And then what you do is you run the attenuation knob up at least the same amount, if not sometimes more. And what that will do...
Wait, you're boosting and cutting the same frequency?
At the same time. It does this wonderfully cool thing. It has a tendency to really tighten up the low end without getting super muddy when you do this. And so it's a really cool effect to be able to boost and then attenuate at the same frequency at the same time with this particular EQ, because it just gives you this nice, big, fat low end without making it go with your sound. So it's really beautiful for that, which is why I tend to use it on things that need a good solid low end. So I do the same thing with bass. it's the same thing. You know, set that thing up at 100, you boost it up, and then you attenuate it, and your bass gets a nice, funky low end without getting tubby. So it's kind of nice.
Yeah. And the reason why that works is it's that the curve of the attenuation versus the boost is slightly different, so that they're not just nulling each other out. There's a weird sort of like crossover that happens there. So you kind of have to hear it, what it does, but it's almost like you get a little bit of a dip somewhere in there, so that while you have the boost, it dips down a little bit and you get like a little bit of a bump of the at the other side of the crossover. So it's a very, very nice effect. And as we're talking about that point, the first sort of like instruction that came out with the EQP1 was they specifically said that you should not boost and cut at the same time. But then, you know, somebody tried something out, and it's this great trick, right?
Yes, it's a wonderful trick. It's funny that they actually tell you not to do it, but screw that, because you know, if you try it and it sounds good, then it is good. That's the general reality of things. However, sometimes you boost too much and you attenuate too much, and then it becomes a real problem. So,
well, yeah, I mean, you feed a kid too much ice cream, and eventually they'll puke, right? So it's like it can be too much of a good thing, right?
Sure. So that's the first thing. But I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier. Is it did take me a little while to wrap my head around how the EQ interface actually works, because there's one triangle that is geared for the low end, and that's off to the left side as you're looking at it. The middle triangle, which is kind of a triangle, it's a kind of
an upside down triangle. The point is pointing up
at this point, and that is your high end shelf ish thing, not selfish but shelfish. Where you have your choices on the EQP1A, and I think it's 3, 4, 5, 8, 10, and 16, if I'm going by memory. Because I'm trying to like view this in my head as I'm
3, 4, 5, 8,
visualizing
10, 12, and 16. Yeah.
Okay, I missed a 12. Anyway, that the boost is sitting above your selector switch, and your Q, or your range of how wide the amount of boost is going to be, is off to the left side of this selector switch. And then your last triangle on the right hand side, so to speak, is your attenuation of the high end that has the switches 5, 10, and 20 dB.
Right.
And depending on certain elements to the sound, like if you asking me about guitars, when I use it on guitars, oftentimes I'm not going to try and boost the super high end of the guitars, because that would start interfering with other elements in the mix. If you're talking about drums, say, and you want to have a sparkly top end on your cymbals, you don't want the guitars to be sparkly up in there either, or at the same time.
Yeah,
generally speaking.
And a lot of times on guitars, there's not a whole bunch of valid information up there. It's basically just like sizzle type of thing. Yeah.
So you use the attenuation knob, and you set it usually I will attenuate at either 5 or 10K, depending on how bright I want those guitars to feel in the mix. And then I will attenuate the top end down on that. So in terms of using it vocally speaking, I generally will use the I won't even use the attenuator on a vocal. I will use the low end boost and attenuation depending on how much foundation I need, I guess would be a good way of saying it, underneath the vocal. And then with the high end, I'm generally going to be boosting way up there, the 16, to kind of give the air a bit more of a sparkle.
Okay.
And that kind of goes in line with how I would use another famous EQ that we'll do a deep dive on in a future episode. And I don't even want to mention it right now, because then people will be like, oh, when. So.
Okay, yeah. I know what you're
we'll
talking
have to
about.
figure it out. So,
but
I think we'll do that one as a super special kind of deep dive when we get to that episode.
Hopefully we'll be able to do something really cool
off really cool with that one. Yes. So yeah, so generally speaking, that's how I would use that. If there was something in the middle of the vocal range that I would need, I would use a second EQ. Whether I would use the MEQ5 or another EQ like a Neve or something in addition to that is entirely up to the range of what's happening in the middle of the vocal. But generally speaking, the EQP1A I would be using for giving a nice solid foundation by using the boost and attenuation on the low end and then sparkling up the super high end.
So would you use the PulTec first or second in order of EQs if you needed to do some EQing on a vocal, for example?
I would probably use it on the last part. I usually use it on the last part of the chain. It'd be
Right,
the
so
last
you do
thing.
any kind of like corrective stuff
Yes,
first,
what
should you
happened
need
first,
to,
and
or
then I
any
would be
mid
using
type of stuff.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And
Very
also,
cool, yeah.
same generally tends to happen for compression. I will compress first, then EQ, generally. Unless there's a super problematic thing that I want the compressor to kind of hide, then I would EQ aggressively into the compressor for it to compress that down, so to speak.
So you're almost using it almost like a side chain,
Yes,
almost into the compressor. Yeah. All right. Cool. Any other uses that you have for the PulTec where you like to do it? So we talked about
I
kick,
generally
we
don't
talked
use
about
it on
vocals,
synths.
guitars.
So I very rarely will ever use a PulTec on synths, mostly because if you're not creating that sound correctly at the source, why are you EQing it in the recording?
Yeah, and it can be too much of a good thing as well. If everything is boosted in the low end and the high end, you're not really doing anything. Right?
Well, you're doing something. You're just hyping a particular area. And to think about it, I think there's been one instance where the synth needed to be cut off, so to speak, as like a high pass filter. And I used the HLF EQ on that.
Yeah. Where are those set, by the way? I know we're not talking about those, but where are those? Are those fixed frequencies or are they?
It's been a while since here, let me look it up real quick because it's been a while since I've actually opened one up. It says here that it is selectable because it's got a certain like slope to it already. So you're just selecting the frequency and your selection choices are, can we get in there? Let me look. Don't do that. Bad. If you can see me, you're probably getting a big big set of Jody nose in the screen. All right. So we have selectable frequencies of 50, 80, 100, 150, 250, 500, 750, 1K, 1.5K, and 2K as your low cutoff or your high pass part of the filter.
Wow, that goes really high.
Yeah, it goes pretty far. And then for the high end portion of this, you go from 15K, 12K, 10K, 8K, 6K, 5K, 4K, 3K, 2K, and 1.5K. So those are your ranges on your high and low settings, right?
All right. Okay, cool. All right. Should we move into the next segment here?
What is the next segment?
Well, today I get to say it's Friday Find.
Well, all right. You kicked it off yourself. And since it's Friday
I kicked it off
Find,
myself. Yeah. All right, I'm just going to take the reins.
Yeah, take it.
This is going to seem like weird after today's episode, but I have a newfound appreciation for the PulTec.
You don't say.
Yeah, because I historically haven't used it a whole lot. So I'm intrigued by this.
We've created our own monster here, people.
Yeah. So I'd have to pick the PulTec EQ. I want to try a couple of different ones. I frequently use the Slate custom EQ series, but as I said, it's not a one-to-one recreation of the PulTec. So I'm going to dive in more to this, and I'm intrigued and see what this is going to do to some of my workflow.
Oh, yeah?
So, yeah, I think so. So what about you, Jody? What you got for us?
My big thing this week is that iZotope has announced an update to their vinyl plugin, which allows you to...
iZotope.
Yeah, well done, you. iZotope had a plugin for the longest time called Vinyl, which allowed you to essentially throw a plugin onto a sound that recreated the concept of varying. What's that? It's not just vinyl, but the actual like record needles of different eras of phonographs.
Yeah, it sounds like the audio is coming from vinyl that has
from vinyl
different
through
levels
a particular,
of wear.
Yeah, through a particular phonograph, and based on the era that you're listening to or the era that you want it to sound like it came from. In addition to that, the fun thing about it is you can randomly add dust particles and scratch sounds. Because if you ever worked with vinyl and you have like accidentally bumped the phonograph player and you hear this thing go skipping across the, that usually leaves a mark on your vinyl. And that vinyl then, when it plays back, will have a little in the sound. And
indeed,
as I remember, as a very wee little kid, my dad used to be very, very sanctimonious about his records. And
good for him.
Yeah, he had this setup, and I don't remember the company that made it, but it was like this bar, and it's like a soap bar looking thing that had this velvet.
Oh yeah,
velvet kind of bottom
absolutely.
To it. And I don't know. And then he had like this special fluid that he would squirt onto this thing. Yeah. And as the record was spinning around on the phonograph without the needle being on it, of course, he would very carefully wipe the record with this thing, and it would clean off the vinyl and take all the dust out of the grooves and everything else with this special device. And it was like, wow. So for whatever reason, some people actually want that stuff in their sound, and the vinyl plugin adds that stuff in there.
Yeah. No,
so
it's
you can
cool.
make it sound like you got a very dusty, scratched up record. Why?
It's a cool effect. I've used it several times as an effect. It's very cool. Yeah.
I actually have an old demo that I used it where I actually took the entire mix and ran it through the vinyl plugin and then slowly faded it off that into the full digital quality sound of the audio. So yeah, there's cool ways to make use of this plugin, at least the older version that I have used, and I am now updated to the new version because it is free. So if you want to sound like you're playing through vinyl on your recordings, you might as well go get the iZotope vinyl plugin because it's free. You can't beat that. Well, you could. You could beat it, but
absolutely. Yeah.
Anyway, so with that in mind, we've now covered our Friday finds. We haven't really mentioned the 2-Minute Tuesday, and the 2-Minute Tuesday, I think this week should be how to make use of the PulTec EQ on, say, kick drum.
That sounds like a brilliant idea.
So the 2-Minute Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, will be the PulTec EQ on a kick drum and how it gets used in that regard. In addition to that, while we still have your attention, please go to the website and give us a review at Inside the Recording Studio /review. Or you can go to just InsideTheRecordingStudio.com and you can sign up for our email list. And the fun thing about that is you'll start learning more about Chris and I than you probably ever wanted to know. But in case you want to know more about us, that's going to be a really good way for you to get to know us a little better and how we are the recording goofballs that we are in this world. Anyway, in addition to that, we'll also try and make sure that you don't miss new episodes. And if you really want something fun and cool, send an email to Goldstar, GOLDSTAR, at InsideTheRecordingStudio.com with the word PulTec in it, and you might just get a surprise. Or if you want to also contact us through the website, you can find out or give us suggestions. You wouldn't find out suggestions. You could give us suggestions as to what you would like to hear us pontificate upon in the future. And we will take it into consideration just for you.
Indeed.
Indeed. All right. And with that,
Indeed.
It's time to say goodbye. Sayonara. Bis
Vi
dann.
hörs. Syns nästa vecka.
Later.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We do appreciate it. Hej då.